They called you a good kid. Quiet, composed, no trouble at school, no rebellion. You knew how to make people smile, even when you were breaking inside. But what they didn't see was the cost. Because being the good child isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's a strategy, a survival mechanism forged in the silence of a home where love was conditional and peace meant pleasing the unpredictable. What if your discipline wasn't strength, but a trauma response? Overachieving, over-caretaking, learning how to shape-shift your needs out of existence. Not because you were praised, but because no one ever made you feel safe. Maybe you were the emotional sponge, the peacekeeper, the one who stayed invisible to avoid becoming the target. But inside, something started to split. You became who they needed you to be, and slowly forgot who you actually were. Have you ever felt like your whole personality was built around keeping the peace? Because this isn't about blame. It's about naming the invisible roles we were forced into, so we can finally step out of them. The good child archetype might look noble, but behind it is a deep wound, one that Carl Jung and Alice Miller both warned us not to ignore. Because when you're raised by a narcissistic or emotionally immature parent, love becomes a transaction. And your true self, that gets buried beneath performance. But what happens when the performance no longer works? As a child, you learn to read the room like a script. Who's tense? Who's tired? Who might explode? Your nervous system became a radar, constantly scanning for shifts in mood, tone, energy. You weren't just a child. You were a caretaker in disguise. Not because anyone asked you to be, but because deep down, you believed that being good was how you earned love. But here's the truth no one told you. Love that has to be earned isn't love. It's control. And when a parent needs to be adored, obeyed, or emotionally taken care of, you become a mirror, not a child. That's what Alice Miller saw in her decades of research. The gifted child is often just the most emotionally abandoned one, the one who adapted the fastest, who read their parents' unspoken wounds and became the balm. But there's a cost. Because when your identity is shaped around meeting someone else's needs, you lose access to your own. You don't know what you like, only what gets approval. You don't know what you feel, only what keeps the peace. And slowly, that mask becomes your face. Have you ever said, "I'm fine," so many times? You started to believe it? This is the hidden legacy of emotional enmeshment. You look successful, high-functioning, but underneath, you're exhausted from performing. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to survive in society. But the longer we wear it, the further we drift from the self. And if you've ever felt numb, disconnected, or like your life doesn't quite feel like yours, you're not broken. You're just buried. You grow up thinking you left it all behind. The childhood, the chaos, the ache for approval. But it doesn't stay in the past. It hides in your relationships, your overreactions, your silence, your self-sabotage. And one day, it doesn't look like trauma. It looks like you pushing people away before they can leave. You bending until you break. You staying small so no one feels threatened. This is the legacy of the good child, polished on the outside, panicked on the inside. You don't need to remember what happened in childhood for it to still be running your life. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of yourself you had to exile because they weren't welcome in your childhood home. Your anger, your needs, your boundaries, your sadness. They were too much for someone. So you learned to hide them, and in doing so, hid parts of yourself. But what you bury doesn't die. It festers, it leaks, it explodes in ways you can't predict and can't control. Where does your anger go when you're not allowed to have any? Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But this isn't fate. This is programming. And here's the most painful part. The wounds you didn't choose become the patterns you recreate, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system is searching for what's familiar, even if what's familiar hurt you. This is how generational trauma survives, not just through DNA, but through silence. It starts subtly. You hear yourself say yes when your whole body is screaming no. You stay quiet in moments that beg for truth. You smile when you want to cry. You laugh to hide the rising heat of shame. You leave conversations feeling hollow, not because anything went wrong, but because you abandoned yourself again. Self-betrayal doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like being liked, but not known. It feels like being needed, but never seen. You begin to notice that you're always the one accommodating, the one making peace, the one keeping it all together, even when it's tearing you apart. And the question starts to rise, why do I do this? Why does it feel safer to please than to be honest? Why does someone else's discomfort feel more dangerous than your own? You trace it back to the punishments that came when you showed emotion, to the rewards that came when you were easy, to the fear that came when love was conditional. Can you remember the first time you were praised for disappearing because somewhere along the way you learned that your value lived in your performance, not your presence, not your truth, not your needs? And when that belief takes root, your entire life becomes a performance, even the parts that look like freedom. This is why healing doesn't start with letting go. It starts with looking closer. There's a moment in healing that no one talks about, not enough at least. The moment when you finally say, I can't do this anymore, and you mean it. Not just the burnout, not just the exhaustion, but the identity you've carried like armor, the good child, the pleaser, the one who fixes, holds, softens, swallows. You begin to realize that version of you was never you. It was a survival role, a way to stay safe in a house that only loved shadows of people, never their fullness. So you start doing what once felt impossible. You say no, you stop over-explaining, you disappoint someone on purpose, and you survive it. You speak honestly, even when your voice shakes. You walk away, even when the guilt claws at your back. Healing doesn't feel like becoming your best self. At first, it feels like dying, because every part of you that was built on being agreeable, on being digestible, on being less, starts to crumble. And when it does, you grieve. You grieve who you could have been if you didn't have to earn love. You grieve the years you spent betraying your own body's truth. You grieve the relationships that were never real, just contracts of silent suffering. Have you felt it too? That ache, not for the past, but for the you that never got to exist. Because this is what it costs to stop performing. You lose the approval that was never real. You lose the peace that was built on your silence. You lose the closeness that only existed through your self-erasure. But in that space, something else begins to emerge. Not confidence, not joy, not yet, but clarity. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." That line, it explains everything. Because if you were the good child, you weren't just behaving. You were carrying your parents' shame, their fear, their rage, their unlived dreams and unhealed wounds. And every time you complied, pleased, performed, you were unconsciously absorbing the life they never got to live. That wasn't love, that was survival. Alice Miller, one of the first psychologists to name this dynamic, called it the drama of the gifted child. Gifted, not in intellect, but in sensitivity, in perception, in the ability to read a room before you could even speak. You knew when to smile, when to stay small, when to mirror their mood, because it was safer than having your own. And slowly, you became what they needed, at the cost of who you were. That's the tragedy of this role. You weren't chosen to be the good child. You were shaped into it through absence, invalidation, and unspoken rules. Don't speak, don't need, don't feel too much, don't be too much. And if you ever tried, withdrawal, silence, punishment, guilt, not always overt, but always enough to make you second-guess your own soul. Here's the cruel part. You grew up thinking this was your personality. Quiet, accommodating, hyper-independent. You thought this was just who you are. But what if it's not? What if those traits you carry aren't authentic? They're adaptive? What if you're not just soft-spoken? You're silenced. Not just kind, but terrified of conflict. Not just strong, but emotionally neglected for so long that you had no other choice. Your personality is not just who you are, it's who you had to become to survive. And now you're waking up. Now you're starting to ask, who am I? When I'm no longer who they needed me to be. That's not rebellion, that's return. To self, to truth, to the original voice buried under all that adaptation, and it will terrify them, because when you stop performing the role, you force others to confront the play. You were never supposed to stay small. You were never meant to be a projection, a peacekeeper, a placeholder for someone else's unlived life. That role was handed to you long before you had the words to say no. But now you do. Because healing doesn't start with forgiveness. It starts with recognition. Recognizing that the way you coped, by being the good one, was never your fault. Recognizing that their silence, their control, their manipulation wasn't love. It was fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of their own unresolved pain. And they passed that fear onto you, wrapped in praise, guilt, and impossible expectations. But here's what they never anticipated. That one day, the child would grow up. That one day, the good child would remember. Remember who they were before the performing, before the anxiety, before the self-erasure. That one day, you'd stop choosing peace at the expense of your personhood. And that's what you're doing now. Every boundary you set, every truth you speak, every need you no longer shrink, is an act of revolution. You're not broken. You're breaking free. And yes, it will be messy. There will be grief. Not just for what you went through, but for the self you had to abandon in order to survive it. But you're not alone in this. There's an entire generation waking up, looking around and asking, what have I inherited that ends with me? This isn't just personal, it's ancestral. When you stop playing the good child, You stop carrying the burden of generations who silenced themselves just to be accepted. And that silence stops with you. So now what? Now that you've seen through the mask, now that the good child costume doesn't fit, who are you without the performance? That question isn't just scary, it's sacred. Because what's waiting for you beneath the fear is the real you, the one who never needed to be perfect to be worthy, the one who never needed to earn love by disappearing, the one who has always been whole, even when you were made to feel fragmented. So pause here, right now, and ask yourself, what did I have to abandon to be accepted? And what would it mean to reclaim that part? Because the good child doesn't have to die. They just need to come home, to a new kind of home, one where safety isn't bought with self-sacrifice, one where love doesn't require loyalty to your own suffering, one where truth is welcomed, not punished. This is the return to your voice, raw, steady, unshaken, to your anger, not as destruction, but as holy fire, to your softness, the kind that no longer apologizes for existing, to your boundaries, sacred, firm, and no longer up for debate, to your joy, not the performative smile they trained into you, but the wild, untamed kind that rises from your bones like a birthright. And if that joy disrupts the room, good, let it. You were not born to be palatable. You were born to be powerful. So take up space like it's your birthright, because it is. Speak what was once forbidden. Stand where you were once erased, and become what they never had the courage to be. Because this isn't just healing. It's rebellion. It's resurrection. It's the beginning of the life that was always meant for you, before they taught you to shrink. And you are no longer the good child. You are the free one, the full one, the true one. And you finally come home.